philosophical proposition debated in a comfortable room, but as a fact demonstrated by a limping man carrying his belongings out of a city that had just told him he was not welcome. In Nicopolis, the teaching continued. The students who came to him there were often young men from wealthy families, sent by fathers who thought a year of philosophy might improve their characters, or who had heard that Epictetus was worth hearing. They arrived with their assumptions intact, that the good life required good circumstances, that freedom required freedom from external constraint. That happiness was something you arranged around yourself by accumulating the right things in the right quantities. Epictetus disassembled these assumptions with patience and without cruelty. He would ask them about the things they were pursuing, the career, the reputation, the relationship. And then he would ask them, what happens to your peace of mind when that thing is threatened? What happens when it is taken away? And in the gap between their answer and his next question, many of them began to feel, for the first time, the structural problem he had been pointing at, the way they had built their inner life on an outer foundation, and how precarious that was, and how much energy they were spending on holding it in place. The practice he gave them was not philosophy in the abstract. It was closer to what we might now call attention training, the daily, repeated, unglamorous work of noticing where your mind goes when you are not directing it, and asking, each time it goes there, whether the thing it has gone to is in your power or not. If it is, attend to it. If it is not, notice the noticing and let it pass. This sounds simple. Epictetus never pretended it was. He had spent years in conditions far more demanding than anything his students had encountered, learning to do it imperfectly. He expected imperfection from them too. What he did not expect, what he had no patience for, was the pretense that the work was easier than it was, or that understanding it was the same as doing it. Because the place where understanding breaks down most completely, he had found, was not in ordinary circumstances. It was in pain, real pain, the kind that arrives without warning and does not ask permission and does not care how well you have understood the theory. Pain is not outside the circle. This is the first uncomfortable thing Epictetus says about it, and it is worth stopping on. The body is in the auk iphi eis hemen, not in our power, which means that what happens to the body, including pain, is technically outside the circle. But the response to pain, the story we tell about the pain, the meaning we assign to it, the way we allow it to expand or contract in our awareness, that is entirely inside. And this distinction, which sounds theoretical when you read it in a book, turns out to matter enormously when you are actually in pain and your whole nervous system is telling you that nothing matters except making it stop. Epictetus was in pain for most of his adult life. The leg that Epaphroditus broke did not heal cleanly. It left him with a permanent limp, a daily, physical reminder of what had been done to him, and of the gap between what the body could be subjected to and what the mind was required to endure alongside it. He did not write about this often, or in self-pitying terms. He mentioned it the way you mention something that has become simply a fact of your existence, not invisible, but no longer surprising. The limp was there. It would always be there, and it was, in the technical Stoic sense, preferred to be otherwise, but not required to be otherwise for the life to be good. He developed a very specific position on the relationship between pain and suffering, and it is worth being precise about what he meant, because it is easy to misread it as the kind of thing people say to minimize other people's pain, and it is not that at all. Pain, Epictetus said, is a physical fact. It happens in the body, and it is real. And there is no philosophical position that makes it not real. What philosophy can do, what the practice of prososche, of attention, makes possible, is create a small but significant gap between the sensation and the story, between the pain itself and the suffering, that the mind adds to the pain by telling itself that this is unbearable, that it should not be happening, that life with this pain is not worth living, that the pain means something catastrophic about the future. The suffering is almost always larger than the pain. Not always. There are forms of pain so extreme that the distinction collapses, and Epictetus never pretended otherwise. But in the ordinary range of physical and emotional discomfort that makes up most human experience, the suffering is constructed, built on top of the pain, by a mind that is doing what minds do, making meaning, projecting forward, telling stories, and the story is almost always worse than the thing itself. There is a passage in the Discourses where a student comes to Epictetus complaining of a fever. He is miserable. He is scared. He wants to know what to do. And Epictetus, with the directness that made him sometimes difficult to sit with, tells him to tend to the fever, to rest, to drink water, to do what the body needs, but not, in the meantime, to make it worse with his mind. Not to add to the fever the story that this fever will last forever, or that it is a punishment, or that its presence means his life has gone wrong. The fever is the fever. It is not also a verdict. This is the distinction between pain and suffering that Epictetus was pointing at, and it is genuinely useful, not in the way that motivational statements are useful, glancingly, briefly, before the next difficulty arrives, but in the slow, accumulated way that a practice becomes useful. When you have done the work of noticing over many ordinary days, the difference between what is actually happening and the story you are adding to it, the practice becomes available in the harder moments. Not fully, not always, but more than it would have been if you had never practiced at all. He was teaching this from a body that knew what it was talking about. This is, perhaps, the most important thing about Epictetus as a teacher of pain, that he was not teaching it from a position of physical ease. He was not a healthy man telling suffering people to think better thoughts. He was a man who had been physically damaged by another person's cruelty, who walked with the evidence of that damage every day, who knew from the inside what it was to have pain, as a permanent companion rather than an occasional visitor. And he had found, not all at once, not easily, not without the long years of practice that his teaching describes, that even this was livable, not pleasant, not preferred, but livable in the deepest sense of the word, which is to say that a life containing it could still be, by the measures that actually mattered, a good one. There is a line he returned to often, in various forms. It goes something like this: "It is not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things. He was not minimizing the things. He was locating the lever, the place where a human being actually has some influence over their own experience, in the middle of a world that offers very little influence over much else. Tonight, if there is pain of some kind present, physical or otherwise, this is not an invitation to tell yourself it does not matter. It does. What it is, perhaps, is a small reminder that the pain is one thing, and the story you are building around the pain is another, and that the story, unlike the pain, is something you have some say in. The place where Epictetus tested all of this most directly was not in his own body. It was in the room where he taught, in the conversations with students who were, in their own ways, suffering, and who needed something more than theory to hold on to. What he built for them there, and how he built it, is where we go next. Picture the school. Not a building in any grand sense. A room in Nicopolis, a provincial city on the western coast of Greece. Not Rome, not Athens, not anywhere that a young man from a wealthy family would have chosen as his destination if the choice had been entirely his. The room had no ornamentation worth describing. There was no library of scrolls, no marble busts of philosophers past, no garden for the peripatetic walk that the Athenian tradition had made fashionable. There was a floor. There were people sitting on it. And there was Epictetus, somewhere at the front, asking questions. This is how he taught, not by lecturing, or not primarily, by asking. The discourses, as Arrian recorded them, are full of these exchanges, Epictetus posing a situation, or responding to something a student has said, or picking up a thread from a previous conversation and pulling it somewhere the student did not expect. The method has a Socratic quality to it, that same willingness to use the conversation as a tool for unsettling comfortable assumptions rather than confirming them. But where Socrates could be cruel in his dismantling, there is a coldness in some of the Platonic dialogues that is almost clinical. Epictetus was something different. He was direct without being unkind. He pressed without contempt. He could be sharp, certainly, but the sharpness came from a man who had suffered, and who understood what it cost to pretend that you had not. A student comes in one day and tells Epictetus that his brother is angry with him and will not speak to him. What does Epictetus do? He does not offer consolation. He does not tell the student that the brother will come around, or that time heals, or that the student has done nothing wrong and should not worry. He asks, "And what is your part in this?" Not accusingly, as a genuine question, because Epictetus was interested, always, in the ephi hemen, in what belongs to you, in what you can actually do something about. The brother's anger is outside the circle. The student's response to the brother's anger, what he chooses to feel, how he chooses to behave, whether he meets the estrangement with openness or retreats into his own corresponding anger, that is inside it. This is not what the student came to hear. It rarely was. People came to Epictetus, as people have always come to teachers, hoping to be told that their pain was someone else's fault and that the solution lay somewhere outside themselves. He understood this impulse. He did not mock it. He had felt it himself, in his years as a slave. when the temptation to locate everything wrong in the world in the person who owned him was constant and comprehensible and, in a technical sense, often accurate. The owner was doing wrong things. That was true. And yet, and this was the harder truth, locating the source of his suffering entirely in the owner gave the owner a kind of power over his interior life that Epictetus was not willing to surrender. So he did not, and he taught his students not to, either. The school in Nicopolis was not comfortable, in the way that growth is not comfortable. Students who arrived expecting to be affirmed left unsettled. Students who arrived expecting philosophy to be an intellectual exercise left with something more demanding, a set of practices that required daily application, daily failure, daily return. Epictetus had no patience for the kind of philosophical engagement that stayed in the mind and never reached the hands or the voice or the moment of choice at the end of a difficult day. He used to say that a philosopher's school is a hospital, not a pleasant place, necessarily. A place where sick people come to be treated, where the treatment is sometimes uncomfortable, where the goal is not to feel better immediately, but to become, over time, genuinely healthier. The medicine was attention, the treatment was practice, and the recovery was not a destination you reached, but a direction you kept facing. One of his recurring themes in the classroom was the question of role. What role are you playing? And are you playing it well? He meant this in the broadest sense. You are a son? Perhaps. A husband. A friend. A citizen. A person who has made certain commitments and occupies a certain position in relation to other people. Each of these roles comes with obligations that are, properly understood, entirely within the EP. Hemin, they are yours to fulfill or fail at. And the fulfilling or failing is a matter of your choice, not anyone else's. The question is not whether the role is convenient, or whether the people who share it with you are behaving well, or whether the circumstances are favorable. The question is whether you are doing your part. This sounds demanding. It is. But there is something quietly liberating in it too, which the students sometimes found on their way out of the room after a session that had left them unsettled. Because if the quality of your life depends, finally, on how you play the roles you have been given, and not on whether the roles themselves are fair, or whether the other people in your life are playing their roles correctly, or whether the circumstances happen to be favorable, then something shifts. The locus of the whole project moves inward, and inward is exactly where you have some say. The roles he was most interested in, when he pushed past the professional and the social, were simpler and harder. The role of someone who does not lie, even when lying would be easier. The role of someone who keeps their word, even when no one is checking. The role of someone who treats others as they would wish to be treated, not because it is required, but because it is, in the Stoic sense, natural, the expression of a human being functioning in accordance with what human beings, at their best, are. He had been denied many roles in his life. The role of free person, the role of someone whose body was their own. He understood, from the inside, what it meant to have the external shape of a life constrained by things entirely outside your control. And he had found, In that constrained life, a way to play the only role that had ever been fully his, the role of someone trying, honestly and imperfectly, to think and act well. That role, he believed, was available to everyone, regardless of circumstance, regardless of what had been taken or never given. And the way you inhabited it, the specific, daily texture of how you lived it, was the whole of what he meant by the word philosophy. The next question his students always brought him, eventually, was the hardest one. Not about pain, or control, or the roles we play, about loss, about the things and people we love, and what happens when they are taken from us. Epictetus had a favorite metaphor for the human life, and it came from the theater. We are all, he said, actors in a play, not in the cynical sense, not the sense that life is a performance and nothing behind the performance is real. In the older sense, the sense that the ancient Greeks understood when they built their theaters into hillsides and filled them with thousands of people who came not to be entertained, but to see something true about themselves reflected in the movements of figures on a stage. The play is real. The roles are real. What is not determined in advance is how well you play the one you have been given. The author of the play, whatever force or accident or confluence of circumstances produced the particular life you have, has already written your part. You were born in a certain place, to certain people, at a certain time. You have a certain body, a certain history, a certain set of relationships and obligations and constraints. None of that is negotiable. The author wrote it before you arrived, and you did not get to review the script before accepting the role. What you do get to choose is how you inhabit it. This is the distinction Epictetus was pressing on, and it is finer than it first appears. He was not saying that the role does not matter, that a person born into slavery is no different from a person born into freedom, or that the circumstances of a life are irrelevant to how it is lived. He knew better than most how much circumstances shape a life. What he was saying is that within the role, however constrained, there is always a quality of inhabiting it that is yours to determine. There is always the question of whether you play your part with integrity or without it. And that question is the one that Stoic philosophy is actually about. He used the image of a banquet to make this concrete. Imagine you are a guest at a dinner. The dishes come around, carried by servants. Some of what comes around you take and enjoy, and are grateful for. Some of what comes around has not arrived yet. It is still in the kitchen, still on its way, still somewhere between where it started and where you are sitting. And some of what comes around passes you before you can reach it, or is taken by someone else, or simply does not arrive at your place at the table. The Stoic, Epictetus said, receives what is offered with gratitude, and does not clutch at what has not arrived, and does not grieve excessively what has passed. This is not indifference. It is the recognition that the banquet is not organized around you, that you are a guest, not the host, and that the guest's role is to receive well what is given, not to demand what is not. He applied this to everything, to wealth, which might come around or might not, to health, which might stay or might go, to reputation, to love, to the particular texture of a day that goes the way you hoped or goes entirely otherwise. All of it, he said, is the banquet. All of it is what the play has written into your scene. The question is never whether the scene is the one you would have written for yourself. The question is whether you are in it fully, playing your part as well as it can be played. Present to what is actually there, rather than somewhere else in your head. Mourning what is not. This metaphor had a sharp edge that his students sometimes felt before they understood it. If life is a play and we are actors, then the actor's job is to play the role as written, not to rewrite it, not to refuse it because it is not the role we wanted, not to perform it badly out of resentment toward the author. An actor who refuses to play the villain because he would prefer to play the hero is not a better person. He is a worse actor. And the Stoic argument is that being a worse actor, refusing your actual life in favor of the life you think you deserve, is not a moral position. It is just suffering, extended indefinitely, with no benefit to anyone. Epictetus was gentle with the students who pushed back on this. He understood the push. He had spent years in a role he had not chosen and would not have chosen. And he knew from the inside the difference between acceptance that is alive, that engages fully with what is actually here, and resignation that is dead, that goes through the motions while internally refusing to be present. He was not teaching resignation. He was teaching something much harder, which was genuine. Eyes-open presence to the life you actually have, including the parts that are difficult, including the parts that are unjust, including the parts that you would change if you could. He had one more thing to say about roles, which he came back to in different forms across the discourses. It was this: you are always playing more than one role at once. You are a child, perhaps, and a parent, and a friend, and a member of a community, and a citizen of the world. And the obligations of these roles sometimes conflict, and the conflicts are real. And navigating them requires judgment that no rule book can supply in advance. What Stoic philosophy gives you is not the answers to these conflicts. It gives you the quality of attention that makes it possible to see the conflicts clearly, which is the prerequisite for navigating them at all. The banquet keeps moving, the play keeps going, and the roles we are given, the ones we did not choose, the ones we would not have chosen, the ones that sometimes feel like too much and sometimes feel like not enough, are, in the end, the only material we have to work with. What Epictetus found, and what his teaching tries to pass on, is that this material is enough, not ideal, not always fair, but enough, if you are willing to be present to it, and to play your part, and to receive what comes around with something resembling grace. The hardest test of that grace, for most of his students, was not in the ordinary days. It was in the days of loss, the days when the banquet took something back. There is a passage in the Enchiridion that stops people. Not because it is difficult to understand. It is, in fact, one of the clearest things Epictetus ever wrote. It stops people because of what it asks. It goes something like this: never say about anything that you have lost it. Say only that you have returned it. Your child has died? It has been returned. Your wife has died? She has been returned. Your property has been taken. It has been returned. But the man who took it is wicked. What does it matter to you through whom the one who gave it asked for it back? Read slowly. This is not callousness. It is something else entirely. Epictetus was not telling his students not to grieve. He was not telling them that loss does not hurt, or that the people they loved were not worth loving, or that death is a small thing dressed up as a large one. He had lived too close to loss to say any of that with a straight face. What he was offering was a different frame, not a replacement for grief, but a different place to stand while grieving. One that did not add the weight of I have been robbed to the already heavy weight of I have lost someone I loved. The distinction matters enormously. When we lose something, someone, the grief has two components. The first is the actual absence, the space where the person was, now empty. The sound of their voice no longer in the room. The particular way they looked at you, no longer available. This is real, and it is painful, and no philosophy in the world makes it otherwise. Epictetus would not have tried. The second component is the story that the loss is unjust, that it should not have happened, that the universe owes you the continued presence of the person you lost, and has broken a contract by taking them, that their absence is a theft, a violation, a wound inflicted by something malicious or careless, or simply indifferent to what you needed. This story is also painful, and unlike the first component, the actual absence, which is simply what it is, this story is something the mind constructs, something that can, with effort and practice and time, be examined. Epictetus was asking his students to examine it, not to abandon the grief. The grief is appropriate and honest and part of what it means to have loved something, but to separate the grief from the accusation, to feel the loss without also feeling that something wrong has been done to you, because the person you loved was not yours in the way that a possession is yours. They were given, lent, in the language Epictetus preferred, and the lending always carried within it the possibility of return. You knew this, somewhere, even when you loved them most fiercely. Everyone knows it. The Stoic practice is simply the attempt to know it clearly enough that the returning, when it comes, does not destroy you. A student came to him once. The story is in the Discourses, whose child had just died. The student was in pieces. He had run from the bedside, unable to be present for the moment of death, unable to stay in the room where his child lay. He came to Epictetus not for philosophy, but for something simpler, some acknowledgement that what had happened was unbearable, that the running was understandable, that the pain was legitimate. Epictetus gave him this. He did not immediately begin the lecture on returning and lending. He sat with the man in the fact of what had happened, and then, gently, after a time, he began to ask questions, not to replace the grief, but to introduce something alongside it. A way of thinking about the loss that did not require the loss to be reversed in order for the man to continue living. The child had been real. The love had been real. The death was real. None of this was in dispute. What Epictetus was working on, slowly and carefully, was the story the man was telling about what the death meant. The story that it was an outrage, a theft, a thing that should not have been. and whether that story was helping him or harming him, and whether a different story was possible without betraying the love that the first story was trying to protect. This is the hardest work Epictetus did, harder than the philosophical arguments, harder than the classroom exchanges, harder than the teaching on pain and control and the dichotomy of the EPH hemen, sitting with people in their grief and asking, gently, whether the frame around the grief was the right one. This required not just knowledge, but the kind of compassion that comes only from having suffered yourself and found your way through to something that was not the suffering. Without pretending the path was shorter or easier than it was. He had lost people too. The record does not tell us who or when, but he was not an island. Whatever the philosophy might suggest, he had attachments. He had people he loved in the complicated, hemen-violating way that human beings love, fully, without reservation, in full knowledge that the loving made him vulnerable to exactly the loss he spent his life teaching others to bear. And he had borne it. That is all we can say with certainty. He had borne it and kept teaching, and kept asking the students the questions that he had once needed to be asked himself by someone or something that the record does not name. Tonight, if there is a loss sitting somewhere in the room with you, recent or old, sharp or worn smooth by time, this is perhaps what the teaching offers. Not that it was not real, not that it did not matter, only that what was given, and what was returned, and that somewhere in the gap between those two facts, there is still a life to be lived, still a role to play, still a banquet moving around the table. The question of what comes after the loss, what remains when everything external is stripped away, was the question Epictetus returned to at the end of his own life. In the last years in Nicopolis, when the school was smaller and his body was older, and the things that had once seemed urgent had grown quiet, Epictetus kept an oil lamp in his room. It was a simple thing, clay, a wick, the kind of lamp that thousands of people in the Roman world used every day without thinking about it. But Epictetus thought about it. After he died, someone stole it. The story made its way into the historical record, not because the theft was significant, but because of what it prompted people to say about him, that he had attached so little importance to the lamp, had held it so lightly that its absence would not have troubled him much, that he would have said, if asked, "The lamp is gone. Let it go." He had said something like this about death. Not once, but many times, in many forms, across the discourses and the Enchiridion. He returned to death the way Marcus returned to the list of the dead, not out of morbidity, but out of the conviction that a person who has not made peace with the fact of their own ending is a person who is carrying a weight they do not need to carry, every day, through every hour of a life that is already finite enough without the additional burden of refusing to acknowledge it. The image he used most often was a lamp going out. When the lamp goes out, he said, I will go out too. Not dramatically, not in protest. The way a lamp goes out when the oil is finished, quietly, without ceremony, because the thing it was doing is done. He did not mean this as a statement of nihilism, that life is meaningless because it ends, that the flame matters less because it is finite. He meant almost exactly the opposite, The flame is what it is because it burns. Its burning is not diminished by the fact that it will stop. And the life is what it is because it is lived. Its living is not diminished by the fact that it will end. This was, for Epictetus, not a philosophical position arrived at through argument. It was a fact he had been living with since the moment he understood what his situation was. A slave. In a world where slaves could be killed without legal consequence. In a body that his owner had already demonstrated a willingness to damage. He had not had the luxury of avoiding the thought of his own death. It had been present from early on, not as an abstraction, but as a genuine possibility on any given day. And he had found, slowly, that its presence was not the catastrophe he might have expected. The Stoics called this practice melite thanatou, the meditation on death, not the obsessive dwelling on it, not the performance of morbidity, but the simple, daily acknowledgement that this life is finite, and that the finitude is a feature rather than a flaw. When you know that time is limited, you stop wasting it on the things that, examined clearly, are not worth the time. You stop deferring the things that matter. You stop treating the people around you as if they will always be there, or treating yourself as if you will always have another chance. He had a particular formulation for this, which his students heard many times. He said, "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live. Not the ending, the not starting, the life spent in preparation for a life, in the careful management of a future that never quite arrives, because you are always too busy making sure it will be safe before you enter it." There is something in this that speaks directly to the particular darkness of the middle of the night, when the mind tends to run in exactly this direction, toward the future and its uncertainties, toward the things that might go wrong, toward the elaborate structures of worry that we build around the possibility of loss before the loss has even arrived. Epictetus would recognize this immediately. He had a name for it, the tyranny of the auk ephi hemin, the way the things outside the circle colonize the space inside it, filling it with their demands until there is no room left for the life that is actually happening. The lamp does not worry about going out. It burns. He was an old man by the end, in that small room in Nicopolis, and the record of his last years is thin. We know the school continued. We know students still came. We know that Arrian, who would later serve as a general and a governor and write a history of Alexander the Great, had been among his students in the early years and had written down what he heard. We know that Marcus Aurelius, who was born while Epictetus was in his prime, read the transcriptions and was shaped by them in ways he acknowledged in the Meditations. And we know that Epictetus, whenever the end came, was probably not afraid. Not because he was brave in the theatrical sense, not because he had conquered fear through willpower or discipline or the suppression of what was natural, but because he had done the work, the daily, unglamorous, imperfect work of acquainting himself with the fact of his own mortality, of holding his life lightly enough that its return, when it came, would not feel like a robbery. He had borrowed it. He had used it as well as he could. And when the time came to give it back, he would give it back the way he had received it, without demanding that it be other than it was. The lamp, the door, the oil, and the burning, and the going out. What remained in that room after the burning was not nothing. It was the teaching, the words Arian had written down, the students who had carried the questions back to their own lives, the long thread of the tradition that had begun before Epictetus and would continue long after him, through Marcus and through Seneca and through the centuries and through this night. In whatever quiet room you are lying in right now, what he had found in that life of almost nothing was a kind of peace, not the peace of having arrived somewhere, the peace of having stopped fighting the place where you already are. That peace has a name in the Stoic tradition. It is not happiness, exactly. It is not the absence of difficulty or pain or loss. It is something quieter and more durable than any of those things. And it is what we arrive at now, in the last hours of this night. The Stoics had a word for what they were ultimately after. The word is eudaimonia, which is usually translated as happiness, though happiness is not quite right. It is too thin, too contingent on feeling good on a given Tuesday, too dependent on circumstances that are, as Epictetus spent his entire career pointing out, mostly outside the circle. The Stoics meant something more stable, more structural, something that did not rise and fall with the weather of the day, but sat underneath all of it. Available even on the bad days, especially on the bad days, as long as the practice was intact. A closer translation might be flourishing, or perhaps simply a life that is working, from the inside out. Epictetus used a different word for the specific texture of this state. He called it ataraxia, tranquility. Not the tranquility of a person who has been fortunate, whose life has arranged itself conveniently, who has not yet been tested by anything serious. The tranquility of a person who has been tested, who has lost things and borne things and found, on the other side of the losing and the bearing, that something essential remained intact, that the self, the part inside the circle, the part that chooses and judges and responds, was still there, still functioning, still, in the deepest sense, free. This is what he was teaching toward, not contentment as a feeling, but stability as a practice. And the practice, as he described it, had a specific quality that distinguished it from both resignation and from the performed cheerfulness of a person who has decided to be positive in the face of difficulty. It was not the suppression of response. Epictetus felt things, anger, grief, frustration, the full range of what a human being feels when a human life is lived. What the practice changed was not the feeling, but the relationship to the feeling. The feeling arrived. It was noted. It was, where appropriate, acted on. And then it passed, the way weather passes, without leaving permanent damage to the landscape underneath. He had an image for this that appears in the discourses in a form that has been paraphrased many times. He said, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." Read slowly. This is not the instruction to want less, or to lower your expectations, or to settle for whatever arrives without preference or desire. It is something more precise. It is the instruction to align the will, the deepest wanting, with the actual shape of what is, rather than with the imagined shape of what should be. Not because what is always good, or fair, or what you would have chosen, but because the gap between what is and what should be is exactly the space in which suffering lives, and closing that gap, even partially, even imperfectly, is what the practice is for. This is very hard. Epictetus never pretended otherwise. It is hard because the wanting is deep, and the things we want are often genuinely worth wanting: the health of people we love, the resolution of genuine injustice, the continuation of things that are good. It is hard because the world is not organized around our preferences, and the recognition of this feels, at first, like a kind of defeat, like being asked to stop caring about things that deserve to be cared about. But Epictetus was not asking anyone to stop caring. He was asking for something more surgical, the separation of the caring from the demand. You can love something without requiring it to be permanent. You can want something without making your peace contingent on getting it. You can engage fully with the life you have, including its difficulties, including its losses, including the parts that are genuinely hard, and still, not easily, not automatically, but through practice, find that the ground underneath is more stable than the weather above it. Tranquility, in this sense, is not a mood. It is a posture. The posture of a person who has done enough of the work to know, not in the head but in the body, that they can bear what comes, not because what comes will always be bearable in the ordinary sense, but because the bearing itself, the capacity to receive and remain, is something that has been built, deliberately and over time, and that does not disappear when the next difficult thing arrives. He demonstrated this not in his writing, which is someone else's record of his words, but in his life, in the way he moved through it from slave to freedman, to exile to teacher, in the way the limp never left, but neither did the teaching, in the way the small room in Nicopolis became, against all reasonable expectation, a place that people traveled across an empire to reach. There is a quality to the final years of his life, as far as we can read them through the sparse record, that is consistent with what he taught. Not contentment in a shallow sense, not the absence of difficulty, but a kind of settledness, the quality of a person who has arrived not at a destination, but at a way of being in motion that no longer requires the motion to stop before peace is possible. The lamp burned. For as long as it burned, it gave light. And the light it gave, the teaching, the questions, the particular way of looking at a life that Arian wrote down and Marcus read, and which has traveled across 2,000 years to arrive in this room. Tonight, that light did not go out with the lamp. It is here now, in whatever quiet you have found, in whatever space exists between the day that has just finished and the sleep that is coming. The old teachers have said what they came to say, not answers. They were never offering answers, only a way of holding the questions that makes the night and the morning after it a little more livable. What they leave behind, when the words grow quiet, is the simplest thing they ever taught. And what that is, exactly, is where we go last. Epictetus did not write a word. This is the first thing worth remembering about what he left behind. In a tradition full of prolific writers, Marcus with his notebooks, Seneca with his letters, Plato with his dialogues, Aristotle with his everything, Epictetus wrote nothing. Not from inability, not from indifference. He chose not to. He believed, apparently, that the teaching lived in the exchange, in the question asked and the answer fumbled toward, and the silence that followed when the student finally understood something that could not have been handed to them directly. Writing it down, he may have thought, was a kind of flattening, a reduction of something alive into something fixed. Arian disagreed, or perhaps he simply could not bear the thought of those words dissolving into the air of Nicopolis when the man who spoke them was gone. So he wrote them down, 4 books of discourses, and the Enchiridion, the little handbook, the compressed essence of what a student might carry away from the school and into an ordinary life. And because Arian wrote them down, Marcus Aurelius could read them, and because Marcus read them, the meditations have the shape they have, and because the meditations have the shape they have, people in every century since have found in them something that felt, unexpectedly, like company. This is what Epictetus left behind, not a library, a thread. A thread that runs from a small room in Nicopolis through the military tent of an emperor on the Danube, through the centuries of people who read and argued and disagreed and returned to the same questions in new forms, through every person who has ever lain awake at night, turning over the same handful of problems that have always troubled the people who are paying attention. What can I actually change? And what must I accept? And how do I tell the difference? And how do I live well in the space between what I can control and everything I cannot? He owned nothing at the end of his life that he had not owned at the beginning. The room in Nicopolis was small. The bed was simple. The lamp, the famous lamp, was just a lamp. He had not accumulated. He had not built. He had taught, and eaten, and slept, and woken up and taught again. And at some point the teaching stopped, and the man was gone. And the only things that remained were the words Arian had written down and the lives of the students who had carried the questions home with them. This is enough. This is, in fact, quite a lot. There is something the teaching comes back to, again and again, across all the forms it takes in the discourses and the Enchiridion and the meditations and the long tradition it fed. Something so simple that it is easy to miss precisely because it is so simple. It is this: you are here, right now, in this moment, in this body, in this room, with this breath moving in and out of you. You are here, not in the past, which is finished and cannot be changed, not in the future, which has not arrived and may not arrive as imagined. Here, the Stoics spent so much time on the sophisticated machinery of the practice, the dichotomy of control, the evening review, the view from above, the meditation on death, because human beings need the machinery. The mind does not stay here on its own. It goes elsewhere constantly, pulled by memory and anticipation and worry and regret, and the machinery is what brings it back. But the machinery is not the point. The point is what the machinery returns you to. this moment, this breath, this quiet. Epictetus never described enlightenment. He never claimed to have arrived anywhere final. He described a practice, imperfect, continuous, requiring daily renewal, that made it more possible, on more days, to be actually present to the life you are living, rather than the one you are afraid of losing, or the one you are hoping will eventually begin. That is all. It is not glamorous. It is not dramatic. It is the least dramatic thing imaginable. A person, in a room, breathing, present to what is actually here. He had that. At the end, in the small room, with the lamp, in the provincial city far from Rome. Whatever the day had brought, good students or difficult ones, easy conversations or hard ones, a body that cooperated or one that did not. He had that, the capacity to be where he was, to be, in the final accounting, genuinely here. And tonight, in whatever room you are in, with whatever the day has left behind, in you, the tiredness, the unresolved things, the thoughts that keep returning, there is something available that does not require resolution or understanding or the arrival of any particular feeling. Just this, the weight of the body settling, the breath, which has been there the whole time, continuing, the night, which is simply the night, doing what the night does. Marcus and Epictetus both found their way here, from such different directions. One from the palace, one from the slave quarters, one with all the resources of the ancient world at his disposal, one with a limp and a clay lamp, both of them, in the end, pointing at the same small thing. Be here, that is the whole of it. Not because here is always comfortable, or because the being here will fix anything that needs fixing, but because here is where the life is, all of it, the only place it has ever been, or ever will be, and the night that is here right now, this specific night, with you in it, breathing, is not a waiting room for something better. It is the thing itself. The old teachers have gone quiet now. Their words have done what words can do, and the rest belongs to the silence. Somewhere tonight, 2 candles have gone out. One in a leather tent along the Danube, where a tired man finished writing and set down his pen and closed his eyes, and the empire waited for morning without him knowing it. One in a small room in Nicopolis, where a man with a limp had taught his last class and eaten his simple meal and let the lamp burn down to nothing, because the lamp was just a lamp, and the night was just the night, and both of these things were fine. They did not know each other. They never met. They lived a generation apart, in different corners of the same vast world, and they arrived at the same quiet place by different roads. And tonight, somehow, they are here, not as voices that instruct, not as authorities that demand, just as presences, the way the memory of certain people stays in a room after they have left it, a particular quality of attention that the air holds for a while before it disperses. They sat with you tonight through the weight of the empire and the weight of the chain, through the list of the dead and the lamp going out, through the anger that costs more than it gives, and the grief that can be held without being surrendered to. They did not fix anything. That was never what they came to do. What they offered was something smaller and more durable than fixing, a way of being with what is, a practice of returning, again and again, to the part of you that has not been touched by any of it, not by the day's failures or its small victories, not by the things that were said or the things that went unresolved, not by the worry about tomorrow or the weight of yesterday, the part that is simply here. You are simply here. The breath is still moving. The body has carried you through another day in all its complexity, and it is ready now to rest. The mind has done what minds do, wandered and worried and circled back and gone elsewhere and returned, and it is allowed, tonight, to do less of that. Not by force, not by decision, just by letting the night be what it is, and letting the day be finished, and letting the words of two old teachers settle into wherever words go when they are done being words. They are not in a hurry. They never were. Marcus would say, "What remains of today that is actually yours to carry into sleep? Set the rest down. You will find it again in the morning if you need it, and many things you will not need." Epictetus would say less. He would ask one question and then be quiet. The question would be something like, "What, right now, is actually in your power?" And in the asking, the circle would draw itself again, small, clear, and entirely yours. What is in your power tonight is simple: the breath, the body releasing into wherever you are lying, the choice to stop for these hours, the work of managing everything outside the circle, and to stay, just for now, inside it. The night is doing what the night does. The world is where it is. And you, the part of you that chose to spend these hours in the company of two men who understood something real about what it means to carry a life, you are here. Thank you for being here at Nightward. Rest now. The morning will come when it comes, and the old teachers will still be there, patient as they have always been, ready for the next conversation. Tonight is finished. You are allowed to let it be finished. Sleep well,